We're going to talk about a different bootloader. Now, I've got the bootloader Lilo installed here, and the first thing I need to do is run Lilo config. Lilo config is going to generate a basic Lilo configuration file for me. And in order to get that configuration file active and install Lilo as the bootloader into the master boot record, I would have to run Lilo. But let's take a look at the Lilo configuration file that we've got here. Lilo.conf. Lilo is a bit of an older boot manager, and it's a little bit less configurable than Grub is, and it's certainly not as dynamic as Grub is. One thing about Lilo is if I change the configuration, I need to run Lilo again, where Grub, if I change the configuration, it gets picked up automatically, and I don't actually have to reinstall the bootloader in order to get the configuration updated and loading correctly. So this is a bit of an older bootloader, and so you'll see some settings here that we don't worry about so much anymore, but for a while definitely were a problem. So with larger drives, we've got the logical block addressing, or LBA, and we had to kind of force the use of logical block addressing. And you can see there's also a setting for large memory. With Lilo, I specify a boot. This is actually the boot device. So this is the drive where all of the bits and pieces that we need are going to be located. So you can see here's another example. In this case, we are using a disk identifier rather than something like SDA, which would be the first SCSI device on the system. So lots of settings here, and you can see there are details around what all of the different settings are. In this case, we set the boot map, and then we are going to use a menu rather than text. So we could use a text menu, we can use a configurable menu with different background colors, and of course there's a graphical menu as well. In this case, we're going to use just a basic text menu that has text colors and some different color schemes that we can use. So here's where we set the color scheme. You can see menu scheme there. And then down below, we will eventually get to the point where we are configuring the boot that we actually want to do. So here's an example. We've got image equals /boot /vm linux -3.2.0-4-AMD64. The linux here, the Z right here, indicates that this is a compressed kernel. This means that it has to be decompressed before it runs. The very first thing that happens after the kernel has been loaded into memory is it has to get decompressed. So we've got the kernel image, and remember we specified the disk that this could be located on earlier. So we know the disk, we know that it's in the boot directory, and then after that is the file name. Underneath that, of course, we specify a label. This is what gets set in the menu, so this is what shows up there. We've got our root device, which is a UUID device. And then we've got the initial RAM disk, and it specifies the file name for the initial RAM disk. So this is what was generated by Lilo config. It determined the correct boot image that we are going to be using. And of course, it also detected the correct device that we are going to be booting from, and then the initial RAM disk as well. So as I said earlier, if I want to actually install Lilo and use Lilo rather than Grub, all I would have to do would be to run Lilo. It would go read the configuration file and then install Lilo in place of Grub in the master boot record. I'm not going to do that here. I do generally prefer Grub at this point. There was a time where Lilo was a better bootloader, but Grub is just more configurable. It's dynamic, so I can make changes. Everybody, of course, is going to have their preferences. Grub is the default in most Linux instances, but Lilo is certainly available if that's something that you felt like you wanted to do in place of Grub.